Three things make the Empire great: faith, steel, and gunpowder. From Emperor Magnus the Pious. The Empire, sometimes referred to as the Empire of Man, is an electoral monarchy composed of feudal states that is the largest and most important of the human nations in the old world. It was forged by the warrior king and ascended deity Sigmar from the primitive tribes of human barbarians who inhabited what became the lands of the Southern Empire more than 2,500 years ago. Although not as skilled in craftsmanship as the dwarfs or in magic as the High Elves, the people of the Empire are not beholden by the limits of tradition to the same extent as those elder races, and continue to progress culturally, technologically, and magically. Having yet to succumb to any threat, external or internal, it is the faith, the sense of righteousness, and the unconquerable spirit of the realm's citizens which gives the Empire its strength, as well as the ruthless efficiency of its military and religious orders. The greatest nation of the old world, the Empire is ruled by an emperor and is composed of the descendants of the ancient tribes of mankind, united by the great human warrior Sigmar Heldenhammer after the Battle of Blackfire Pass. Sigmar was deified after his death by his people, and his promise of eternal aid from the Empire for the kingdoms of the dwarfs still stands today. This action solidified the relationship between men and dwarves, and planted the seeds for the burgeoning empire through trade between the two races. Today, the empire is led by Karl Franz I, who rules from his court in the imperial capital city of Altdorf. There are 10 provincial states in the empire, each ultimately ruled by a feudal lord known as an elector count, who owes his or her power to the unifying figurehead and ultimate authority of the emperor. It should be noted that the empire is not truly a single centralized nation, but instead a confederation of individual feudal states united only by the common tongue of Reichsspiel, a shared faith in Sigmar, and a mutual imperial culture. The imperial states correspond roughly to the ancient tribal territories brought together by Sigmar when he united the tribes of man beneath one crown to defeat the greenskins of the old world. The southern imperial states, Averland, Reichland, Stirland, Talabakland, and Wissenland, resemble a broad chalice, partially surrounded by near impassable mountain ranges from which drain the mighty rivers which are the lifeblood of imperial trade. To the west of these are the Grey Mountains, beyond which lies the kingdom of Bretonnia and the Wood Elves' magical forest of Athaloren. To the south are the inhospitable Black Mountains, and to the east are the World's Edge Mountains that mark the eastern extent of the old world. To the north, the rolling hills and rapid streams of the south and east are gradually transformed into the forested lowlands and deep waterways that define the heart of the empire. The vast forests that comprise the central and northern imperial lands stretch almost unbroken across the countless leagues from the state of Reichland to the northern border with Kislev and the shore of the Sea of Claws. The Great Forest, Drakvald Forest, and the Forest of Shadows are all essentially part of the same dark, untamed wilderness, with the green blanket of trees punctured only by the abrupt mountain range known as the Middle Mountains. These lands are divided into the northern imperial states, Hochland, Ostermark, Ostland, Middenland, and Nordland. The inhabitants of these northern states generally have to deal with much greater hardships and military threats than those of the more civilized south, being that much closer to the demons, beastmen, and other dangers of the northern chaos wastes. The life of a citizen of the Empire is a perilous one, for there are foes within every shadow and enemies around every corner. Secret chaos cults abound, or at the very least, there are rumors of them running rampant, as well as the legendary rat men that some call the Skaven. No one is certain who is trustworthy, and fear and paranoia are omnipresent in the isolated settlements that dot the Empire's provinces outside of the major imperial cities. The Empire has a history that stretches back for more than 2,500 years, but much has been forgotten or lost in the intervening centuries. War, fire, flood, and even conspiracy have helped to hide much of the historical record, whether it was recorded in books and scrolls or preserved in the form of artifacts. Present-day Imperial scholars dig and research to discover the hidden truths of the past, but the gaps are many, and their conclusions are often simply wrong or skewed to match their preconceptions and political or religious ideology. Also, some truths are best kept secret from the people of the Empire, lest their revelation spread panic or doubt amongst a previously docile populace. And it is not just uncovering a horrible truth that must be feared, but also dealing with those who would rather keep that information to themselves. In the Empire, the dedicated students of history had best keep a blade ready and be handy with its use. No one now knows when humanity first entered the old world, or from whence they came, though the most ancient records of the dwarves record the steady movement of humans over the World's Edge Mountains over a period of several centuries, sometimes fleeing more powerful tribes of men, other times fleeing the rampaging hordes of greenskins. The earliest known of these migrant peoples are mentioned in the Chronicles of Nirn, Shieldbreaker, an ancient king of Karas al-Karak. The golden leaf of this folio, stamped with the most ancient Khazalid runes of the dwarves that no outsider is allowed to see, record a pastoral human tribe who worshipped the earth itself in the form of the Earth Mother, a religion now remembered as the Druidic Old Faith. Timid around the highly martial dwarves, and persecuted by other tribes in their home territory, they vanished into the forests of the central old world, and faded from view. Dwarf scholars who have lectured on early history estimate that this occurred around minus 1500 IC, some 1500 years before the coronation of Sigmar as the first emperor. Perhaps some 500 years later, in minus 1000 IC, Dwarven Khazalid inscriptions on the walls of Blackfire Pass mark the passing of a massive confederation of tribal peoples from the future lands of the Border Princes and the steppes beyond the World's Edge Mountains. Dwarven historical lays from this time also speak of the migration of the humans. Great danger there was in the east, in the lands of our enemies, and the clans of the manlings fled west, ignorant of the arts of steel and warcraft. They had no weapons that could stand before the goblins and their allies. They gave us gold, cattle, and salt, and we let them pass, protected by our shields. Scholars have noted that many of the tribes listed by the dwarf lay bear names very similar to those who later founded the Empire: the Hunbarokin, Tutokin, Merokin, and Teutonic among them. Unlike the peaceful agricultural tribes that had preceded them in migrating into the heart of the old world, the newcomers were aggressive and the bearers of a culture based on raiding each other for cattle and women. While they could not stand up to the greenskins' iron weapons, their bronze blades and chariots were more than a match for the obsidian and flint of the existing old world human tribes. Within a century of their arrival, the ancestors of the Teutogen, the Unbrogen, and the other founding imperial tribes had displaced the older peoples and taken the best lands of the central old world for themselves. The shield provided by the dwarf halls of the World's Edge Mountains gave some protection, but as dwarven power declined, increasing numbers of orc and goblin warbands found their way through into human lands. They made their hideouts deep within the forests or among the rugged hills and raided the nearby human tribes. Even worse creatures would find their way through the high mountain passes from the south and east, including Chaos Warriors looking for glory for their dark gods, and mutants looking for food and slaughter. These growing threats led to the development of the first true human fortified towns and villages in the lands of the central old world that would become the Empire. In the west, the Unberogans founded a walled village at the confluence of the Reich and Talabek rivers, naming it Reichdorf. In the south, Talian merchants from the once ruined elven city of Miragliano built a fortified trading post on the ruins of an abandoned high elf settlement that quickly became a rallying point for the local tribes in times of trouble. This settlement grew over time and became the city of Nuln. In the north, the Teutogans continue to search for a safe place for their people, until a vision from their patron god Ulrich, the Lord of Winter and Wolves, led them to a flat-topped mountain that stood like a fortified island among the surrounding dense forest lands. There they built their great settlement of Middenheim and named the mountain the Faustschlag, though it is today more commonly known as the Ulrichsburg. This phase of early settlement continued for nearly 1,000 years, -1000 to -1 IC, until the coming of Sigmar and the crisis of the Great Orc Invasion. And now, the rise of Sigmar Unberogen. Together, I cannot do this alone. I need my sword brothers with me. Swear with me, my friends. Swear that everything we do from this day forth will be in service of this vision of a united empire of man. From Sigmar Heldenhammer, the first Emperor. Unsurprisingly for a man who founded the greatest nation of the old world, and then topped off his accomplishment by becoming a god, the origins of Sigmar Heldenhammer are shrouded in myth and legends. Although the Sigmarite cult itself insists that all the stories are true and accepted as religious dogma, even those that outright contradict each other, Imperial and Dwarf scholars agree that Sigmar was born to a family that belonged to the clans of the northern Unberogans, probably at Reikdorf. His birth came in a dangerous time, for there was frequent conflict with the Merogans and the Teutogans, as well as the ever-present threat presented by the Greenskins. Sigmar cult legends say that a twin-tailed comet raced across the heavens on the night of Sigmar's birth, a sign of the god's blessings upon the infant and a herald of the great changes he would make. Young Sigmar grew to be a powerful warrior, even as a youth, and his kinsmen marveled at his ferocity and sheer prowess. In his 15th year, Sigmar was alone in the woods somewhere south of Reikdorf. The exact place has been lost, but some Sigmarites believe it is near Kemperbad, when he heard a band of orcs stomping through the underbush. The orc warband, led by the black orc Vagraz Head Stomper, had ambushed a massive dwarf trading convoy from Karaz-Karak and was returning to camp with the spoils and battered dwarven prisoners. Sigmar and his own warband waylaid the orcs and slew them all in an epic battle beneath the boughs of the forest, where it is said that he was thrown a golden warhammer by a captive dwarf to fight the orcish warlord. Recovering after the battle, Sigmar learned that he had saved the life of none other than Kurgan Ironbeard, the king of Karaz-Karak, who had been captured by Vagraz Headstomper along with several of his kinsmen. The grateful dwarf monarch rewarded the Unberogen warrior with an amazing magical item, the Warhammer Gal Maraz, whose name means Skull Splitter in the dwarven tongue of Khazalid. Allowed to keep the weapon that allowed him to slay the orcish warlord, the two soon became fast friends, and dwarf and man often fought side by side against the growing tide of orcs and goblins. When not fighting greenskins, Sigmar was also busy building his own empire, for he had a vision that mankind would only survive if it stood united against the many and growing dangers threatening it in the old world. Through a combination of guile, diplomacy, bribery, and war, Sigmar brought the various human tribes into his Unberogen-led confederation, with him as its acknowledged leader. He traveled the central old world with his closest friends and his growing unbroken army, aiding the other tribal warlords in defense of their people and slowly earning their trust. One by one, the leaders of the human tribes pledged their support to Sigmar and his Unbroken. Yet several of the tribes still refused to join Sigmar's growing tribal confederation, or were openly hostile and threatened to make war upon the Unbroken and their allies. The tribe of the Bretonii, which had no desire to become a part of the growing tribal confederation, decided to migrate to the west, eventually settling in the region of the old world that would become Bretonia. These people, united in a similar way under their leader and first king, Gilles le Breton, would eventually found the Kingdom of Bretonia. The Teutogons and their chieftain, Arthur, chose to terrorize the neighboring tribes, murdering and pillaging as they chose, refusing to give up the old ways and join with Sigmar. Arthur declared that he would not bow to any man, nor allow his people to give up their ancient heritage. The Teutogons' defiance represented a major challenge to Sigmar's dreams of a united human front against the Greenskins. If the Teutogon chieftain was not defeated, then the other tribes in his confederacy would always have an alternative to unity, and the confederacy would prove to be only a fleeting alliance that would break apart as soon as the overall threat of the Greenskins was defeated, rather than becoming the foundation for a new and better human society as Sigmar wished. As a result, he set out to challenge Arthur and defeat him publicly. He climbed by hand to the top of the mighty mountain Faustschlag, where the Teutogon settlement of Middenheim lay, and fought Arthur to the death in his own throne room. The Knights of the White Wolf, the elite Teutogon warriors who venerated the god Ulrich and had been Arthur's personal warband, pledged from then on to serve Sigmar as his personal guard. Once the Knights of the White Wolf pledged to serve Sigmar as their king and chieftain, the rest of the Teutogon also pledged their allegiance, seeing the favor their god Ulrich had bestowed upon him. All the human tribes of the Central Old World were at last united under Sigmar's leadership. Sigmar then wasted no time. According to legend, in -1 IC, he summoned the tribes to a great area which would one day be the Mootland in the lands of the Eastern Burgundians, and laid his case before them. He recounted all the atrocities committed against humanity by the Greenskins, the burned steadings and murdered families, the stolen cattle and fouled wells. He told them of the danger looming in the mountains, of the huge orc horde the dwarves were struggling to hold back. Sigmar implored the gathered tribes not to meet the orcs and goblins as they had in the past, standing apart from each other, refusing to lend aid and combine their forces when needed. That would only lead to their defeat and deaths. His voice rising with a terrible rage that was felt throughout the gathering, Sigmar called on all the tribes of man to unite and make their common stand with the dwarves, calling it the crucible of a new nation. As recorded in the Book of Origins, Sigmar's final shout of "To war!" was answered with a cheer so loud that the dwarves heard it as far away as Blackfire Pass. History records that Sigmar's army arrived just in time, as the orcs finally breached the wall King Kurgan had built across Blackfire Pass. Leading the charge from the chariot of Sigurd, chieftain of the Burgundians, Sigmar fell upon the greenskins as if he were the god Ulrich himself. The force of the human assault stopped the orc and goblin advance, then began pushing it back. The dwarves saw this as their opportunity and charged from the forts and towers and fell upon the greenskins' flanks. Fear overcame the greenskins and they began to break ranks and flee. Their leader, Warlord Urgluk Bloodfang, rallied his forces and made a counterattack. Charging, he and his warband came face to face with Sigmar and his Knights of the White Wolf. Sigmar and the Orc Warlord entered into single combat, while Sigurd and his elite Burgundian warriors battled Bloodfang's Black Orc bodyguards. Hammer clashed with cleaver as the two struggled for advantage. After nearly an hour of fighting, Sigmar killed the Orc Warlord with a mighty double blow, first breaking the hand that held the cleaver, then smashing Bloodfang's skull on the return stroke. The death of their leader was also the death of the Orc army, which broke and ran in utter panic. The slaughter that followed was terrible to behold, as the armies of man and dwarf fell upon their most hated foes. It is said that there has never been a greater concentration of crows in all the world than that which gathered to feast on the stinking and unburied corpses of the greenskins at Blackfire Pass. So many died that day that it would be over 1,000 years before the orcs and goblins could again rise such an army, even with their prodigious, if unknown, reproduction rates. The founding of an empire. From 0 to 50 IC. After the Battle of Blackfire Pass, the humans returned to their lands, but not to their old ways. All the tribal chiefs recognized that humanity was safer united rather than divided, and they knew that only one among them could truly make that unity a reality. Thus, at Reichdorf, 1 year after the Battle of Blackfire Pass, the Jarl Ulrich, High Priest of the Cult of Ulrich, placed a crown of gold and ivory, a gift from the dwarfs, upon Sigmar's head, and proclaimed him Emperor before the assembled representatives of the human tribes. Before him, the tribal chiefs knelt and swore brotherhood to each other and fealty to Emperor Sigmar and the newborn empire. This moment marks the start of the Imperial calendar and occurred in the year 1 IC. Yet, for all the talk of human unity, Sigmar knew his people and knew that their attachments to the old tribes were too strong to simply be erased. He also acknowledged that the lands of the Empire, from the Grey Mountains in the west to the World's Edge Mountains in the east, and from the Sea of Claws in the north to the Vaults in the south, were simply too big to govern as a centralized realm. He therefore made the best of the political situation and made the chieftains of the 12 tribes counts of the empire. Each count would be sovereign in his own lands, subject only to the laws and edicts the emperor made for the empire as a whole. The tribal lands became the original 12 great provinces of the empire. Alaric the Mad, a dwarf runesmith, forged 12 great magical rune blades, called rune fangs, for each of the tribal chieftains who had sworn to follow Sigmar and who would become the first counts of the empire. The years of Sigmar's reign were a time of peace and growth for the empire. Sigmar decreed the building of 2 great roads, the first from Reichdorf, now called Altdorf, to Middenheim, and the second from Altdorf to Nuln along the banks of the Reich River, and thence to join the Old Dwarf Road in Averland. The Emperor hoped that the roads and rivers together would serve as a tie to bind the tribes to each other and inhibit their natural centrifugal tendencies to come apart. Peace and good weather brought regular harvests, and eventually a booming population. The new Imperials cleared land and laid the foundations for new towns and cities, sometimes over the remains of their fortified tribal camps, other times on unspoiled new lands. The Talutans discovered a vast crater in the midst of the great forest, within which they built their chief city, Talabheim. The Burgundians founded both Averheim and Streysen as fortified trading posts, and eventually at Averheim the Counts of Averland built their great fortress, which has never fallen. Middenheim grew wealthy as the religious capital of the empire, as Ulrich was Sigmar's favored deity. Many Imperials tried to curry favor with the ruler by making donations to his preferred religion. In the south, Nuln prospered as trade along the rivers to and from the dwarf holes of the World's Edge Mountains expanded after the coming of peace. The city grew so powerful and wealthy compared to the rest of the province, then known as Wissenland, that the Counts of Wissenland eventually moved their seat of government there from their former town of Feildorf. Then, after 50 years after ascending the throne, Sigmar announced his abdication to the assembled counts and the high priests of the various cults. My work here is done. The empire is prosperous and united, and in your good hands it will continue to be so. But I have work I must finish, a task left undone, and I must return Gal Miraz to its maker. With that, the first emperor placed his crown on a table, shouldered Gal Miraz, and walked out the door to an unknown final fate. Thus did Sigmar depart the lands of his empire, to the bewilderment and grieving of his peers, in a manner some have compared to the fearsome warrior god of the dwarven race, Grimnir the Fearless. He emerged from the forests onto the eastward plains, where he was flanked on either side by a massive, grey-headed wolf and a towering boar with tusks of black iron. As Sigmar made his way up the eastern hills, his grim eyes set upon the World's Edge Mountains. The great lord's bestial allies came faithfully at his heels, the wolf with its strength and courage, and the boar with its wit and tenacity. Sigmar disappeared into the east, pausing once to look upon his great works and take pride in all that he had accomplished, and even more so in the knowledge that the glory of his people would only grow, No longer did they require his earthly guidance, nor heirs of his blood too. For the land and unity he had created was greater than any one man, any one dynasty. It belonged to the people it had been made for, and it would be guarded by their strength, existing eternally in their minds and souls. They were all his heirs, who would take up his mantle and rule the land in his absence, raising his mighty hammer in honor of the indomitable spirit of humanity and in praise of Ulrich, who had in his benevolence granted him victory. He offered one final goodbye to the people he so loved, and thus turned towards his destiny without another backward glance. He had now reached the climax of Ulrich's wolf path. His reward now stood before him, earned through strength, bloodshed, and unsurpassed heroism, to take his rightful place in the everlasting company of the gods. An era of conquest and prosperity. From 73 to 1000 IC. The gathered counts were faced with a major crisis. Sigmar had never married and, as far as anyone knew, had never produced an heir, nor had he left a will designated who should succeed him on the imperial throne. Never, in the 50 years of his reign, had anyone even considered the question of succession. Several among the counts claimed the throne, some on the basis of being the most skilled in war or politics, while others claimed the favor of the gods, or even a secret promise from Sigmar that they were his heir. The arguments in the Reichhaus grew acrimonious, and the threat of civil war loomed large. When a priestess of Raya, who was in the retinue of the Count of Sturland, suggested an election, let all the counts renew their vows of brotherhood, and then let each explain why he or she should take the imperial crown. The first to get a majority of the votes of his or her peers would become the new emperor or empress. Determined to avoid civil war, the counts agreed and retired to the great hall of Reichhaus to deliberate. After 3 days passed amidst promises, threats, and a great many exchanges of gold, the Jarl Ulrich came forth to announce their new leader, Emperor Folk of Wissenland. As part of the agreement, the counts determined that each new emperor should be chosen from among them, and that the person so chosen could move the imperial capital to his state's chief city. They also elevated a powerful noble of the Reichland to become the first count of that province. In recognition of their role in choosing the emperor, the counts changed their titles to Elector Counts of the Empire. Less than 25 years after Sigmar's disappearance, during the reign of Emperor Hennest in Nuln, a mendicant friar named Johann Hellstorm appeared in Altdorf telling of a new god, the Emperor Sigmar himself. With a wild gleam of enthusiasm in his eyes and the strength of utter conviction in his voice, he preached the word of Sigmar Divine to all who would listen, even gaining acolytes from among the priests of the already existing cults. Not all welcomed his words. Much of the clergy of the other gods dismissed Hellstorm as a madman, his visions a sign that he had been eaten moldy bread. What he claimed verged on blasphemy, for he claimed to have seen a vision that Ulrich himself placed a crown upon Sigmar's head, anointing him as a god and making him the chief of the divine pantheon of the old world. Some wanted him killed, but others proved more tolerant. Hellstorm's new cult preached the unity of the Empire and obedience to the Emperor and the Elector Counts, and so this small cult gained permission to build a temple in Sigmar's home city of Altdorf, with Johann Hellstorm as the first Grand Theogonist of the cult of Sigmar. As the centuries passed, the Sigmarite cult would grow wealthy and politically powerful. Sigmar's worship became so popular in Reichland and Sturland that it practically supplanted the cult of Ulrich in those states, much to the latter cult's irritation. Money from gifts and rents from donated lands flowed into the Sigmarite cult's coffers, until the Grand Theogonist rivaled the wealth and power of the Elector Counts, and the cult began to clamor for their own electoral vote in imperial elections. Emperor Fulk moved his imperial capital to his home city of Null, where it stayed for several centuries, as his heirs succeeded in having themselves elected time after time. This was an era of growth and great vigor for the Empire, as its growing population looked for outlets for their energy. Not satisfied with merely filling in and developing the lands they already possessed, the Elector Counts looked to expand their province's territory and their power relative to one another. From the years of the 5th and 10th century IC, a period imperial historians call the drive to the frontiers, the counts and emperors moved to extend the empire to what they felt were its natural borders. The counts of Ostland and Talabakland aggressively colonized and expanded into the northern lands of what is now Kislev, claiming all the land to the mountains and the river Linsk. But their settlements were rarely successful. Most fortunate were Talabakland's efforts to expand into the land to its southeast. Originally ruled by the heirs of Adalhard of the Ostrogoths, the towns of Ostermark became Talabakland's East March, later regaining their independence when they became the League of Ostermark. Sturland and Avaland, meanwhile, aggressively expanded into the less fertile eastern regions of their home provinces, pressing into the foothills of the World's Edge Mountains the dwarfs claimed as their own, which led to occasional violent clashes. In the process, they incorporated the lesser tribes and small kingdoms of related human peoples that had never joined Sigmar's confederation, particularly the Fanones, whose lands became the new imperial province of Sylvania under the domination of Sturland. The emperor most associated with this period is the 6th century IC emperor Sigismund the Conqueror, who not only defeated the king of the Teutones and added the Teutonsric land to the province of Westerland, now the Wasteland, but also crossed the Grey Mountains to create the West Mark on the Bretonnian side of the mountains, and invaded the southern lands of the Border Princes, then a wild, tribal region, to found the province of Lichtenberg, and built a series of castles to protect the empire's southeastern flank. One area eluded all attempts at conquest: the forested wood elf realm of Lorelorn, to the northwest of the empire. claimed by the Elector Counts of Drakvald, Middenland, and Vesterland, the Wood Elves acknowledged no human overlord and defeated all attempts to conquer them by force. They won their most spectacular victory in 897 IC, when they overwhelmed the army of the Drakvalder Count, whom history remembers only as the Unlucky. The defeat was so crushing that it set the stage for Drakvald's own later degeneracy and eventual disappearance as an imperial great province. By the 10th century IC, the empire had reached the pinnacle of its size and achievements. No power in the old world could match it, and there was talk amongst its rulers of one day governing the whole of the old world. Blind with hubris, the people of the empire could not see the growing cracks that would one day bring the whole imperial structure crashing down around their heads. The Second Millennium, better known as the Imperial Collapse. The beginning of the Second Millennium IC heralded the decay in the once grand fortunes of the Empire. It is now known in Imperial history as a time of hedonistic excess, poor leadership, and civil strife. The Drakvald Elector Counts had become the emperors not long before, bribing their way into the office to use its power to preserve their province's failing position. The defeat at the hands of the Wood Elves and a series of disasters had weakened the province so much that there was fear that it would simply be absorbed by one of the others. The Drakvald emperors moved the imperial capital to the city of Karlborg and began a reign so corrupt that the term Drakvalder to this day is a byword for a greedy, grasping person in the empire. Under the Drakvalders' dubious leadership, the empire would begin to rot away from within. For over a century, emperor after emperor continued the venal ways of the Drakvalder line, looking for any way to enrich themselves and caring more for their pleasures than the prosperity or well-being of the empire they ruled. Fragmentary annals of this time give lurid hints of the debaucheries and orgies held at the imperial court in Karlborg, and of others, even more obscene events. Two events of note took place in the 11th century IC, both during the reign of Emperor Ludwig II Hohenbach, known as Der Große on his coins, but better remembered by history as Ludwig the Fat. Both a gourmand and an avid hedonist, Ludwig was infamous for the torture and execution of chefs who offended his culinary tastes. Finally, he ordered his halfling valet to create a meal worthy of his greatness. The resulting butter-laden feast was so successful that Ludwig not only made his valet the imperial chef, but elevated him to the rank of Elector Count, tearing the fertile farmlands of the halflings away from Sturland and Averland to create the new great province of the Mootland. This appealed to Ludwig II not only because he had enjoyed a fine meal, but it also gave him political vengeance against the Elector Counts of those two states, whose daughters had spurned his greasy attentions. Seeing the success of these tactics, the cult of Sigmar began to slowly woo the grotesquely fat emperor. Invited to a ceaseless round of feasts, banquets, and private suppers, the emperor slowly began to see the cult in a positive light. Folk began to whisper that the Grand Theogenist of Sigmar would sit at Ludwig II's right hand, constantly filling his plate with fine food and his cup with wine. The cult of Sigmar gifted the emperor with a new palace in Altdorf, rumored to be fitted out with extensive kitchens, dining halls, and exceedingly luxurious privies. Eventually, the emperor signed a charter granting the Grand Theogenist of the cult of Sigmar an electoral vote in imperial elections. The Grand Theogenist of the time is said to have died in bed a short while later, smothered to death by his own neck fat. With the rise of the Drakvald line of emperors, the arts saw an explosion of noble patronage. In their quest for self-aggrandizement, the decadent imperial rulers commissioned flattering portraiture, fawning literature, and pompous self-promoting musical scores. The imperial nobility followed suit, and soon every one of any note had artists of one kind or another in their service. Referred to by imperial art historians as the naturalistic movement, the artwork of this period ceased to be a literal record of history as it was. Many noble families seized the chance to have their history recorded in huge tomes. Outrageous claims, tall battlefield tales, and simpering portrayals of forefathers became the norm for such books, leading to some extraordinary and somewhat amusing cases of one-upmanship. Similarly, many nobles chose to have favorable portraits created. Thus, for example, the infamous drooling Duke of Leichburg is depicted as a striking, martially capable man, with not one trace of his humpback and an entirely normal number of eyes. Some nobles went so far as to have their faces painted or woven into famous scenes from imperial history, such as its founding during the Battle of Blackfire Pass. Dismissed by the common folk as utter nonsense, this flowering of the arts saw some improvements for their lot in life as well. The cult of Sigmar was one of the first to seize upon the idea of illuminated books, commissioning lavish tomes after the style of the nobles' histories, focused around the life of Sigmar. These works were frequently treated as objects of homage, with some Sigmarite temples dedicating thousands of gold crowns to their creation. The completion of the soaring Cathedral of Sigmar in Altdorf occasioned the commissioning of 8 such illuminated books, each bound in beaten gold dug from the mountains by the descendants of King Kurgan Ironbeard himself. Completed in 1012 IC, these 8 tomes were paraded with great ceremony throughout the empire before being returned to a vault deep beneath the cathedral. Within the dye trade, the creation of so many works of art caused great leaps forward in coloring and dye fixatives. Not only were tinted inks in great demand, so too were fine shades of cloth and paint. Certain families began to specialize in the hugely expensive pigments required for noble portraiture, experimenting with all manner of ingredients in the quest to find the brightest blue and the most brilliant gold. This short-lived but highly lucrative trade reached its peak in 1023 IC, when Baroness Auerbach of Hochland was reputed to have paid 120,000 crowns for a pearl-based paint that exactly matched the yellow white of her teeth. This brief blossoming of the arts was not to survive for long. The disasters to come would end the decadence of the Dracwald line for good. The year 1053 IC saw the accession of the last and worst of the Dracwald emperors, Boris Hohenbach, known forever to posterity as Boris Goldgather and Boris the Incompetent. Devoted solely to money and its acquisition, he let the elector counts rule as they wished, as long as he received the appropriate gifts. New titles and imperial offices were invented and sold, so now elector counts vied with each other to acquire ever more grandiose titles, such as Grand Prince or Grand Duchess Palatine. A quick bribe would see a troublesome Free Towns charter revoked by the Emperor, the first news of which would come when the soldiers of the local nobleman would seize control and hang the Burgermeister. Others joined the game as the cults began selling ecclesiastical offices to the highest bidders. The Emperor himself would even sell to commoners the right to spend the night in the Imperial Palace, renting out the chambers of the 9th century Emperor Jurgen the Opulent. The Skaven Wars, from 1111 to 1115 IC. Judgment for these practices came in 1111 IC, when plague erupted in several cities at once in the east, spreading inexorably westwards. The easternmost lands of Talabakland and Ostland, which would later become the Kingdom of Kislev, were denuded of even animal life by the virulent disease and had to be abandoned by the Empire. The crowded imperial towns and cities were the hardest hit, and desperate authorities would set fires to burn whole neighborhoods at the first sign of the plague's emergence. Travelers even suspected of carrying the plague were hung and their corpses burned by desperate road wardens. Prayers to the gods went unanswered, with the priests dying at their altars, while the nobles and the wealthy commoners abandoned the urban areas for the relative safety of their rural manors and estates. The Emperor could not have cared less. Boris secluded himself at a palace, miles from Karaborg, and allowed only the wealthiest and most beautiful of his subjects to join him there. Thoughts of plague and postulated peasants were far away. They would laugh and drink and wait for the plague to finally extinguish itself. In the summer of 1115 IC, there was an especially virulent eruption of the plague. The Emperor, most of the Elector Counts, and their immediate families and retainers had gathered at the Karaborg Palace to hold court and wait for the disease to die down once more. One hot summer evening during a ball, they met their own deaths. As the Emperor gorged himself on roast goose and the courtiers danced under the stars, none noticed the figures in ragged robes gathering upwind of them. They were the censer carriers of Clan Pestilence, and this marked the beginning of the Skaven's first assault upon the Empire that was completely ignorant of the mutant rat men's existence. The winds carried the many chemical plagues of the Skaven throughout the palace grounds. Hundreds of the Empire's leaders died that night, buboes sprouting from their bodies and pustules bursting. As he lay dying, Emperor Boris the Incompetent listened as the Skaven leader told him of the rat men's grand plan. How armies of his kin were that very night marching all over the Empire, the heralds of mankind's downfall, the start of the great Skaven Wars. Many Imperial towns and cities fell to the Skaven that night, and for the many that followed as the Skaven Wars erupted all around them. Even if they were not captured outright, the damage done to the Empire's infrastructure was tremendous, as libraries, temples, universities, and whole city districts burned. The Empire's defenders tried to put up a resistance, but they were disorganized and possessed only a shadow of their once potent martial prowess. Great imperial cities like Nuln and Mortheim became islands in a sea of Skaven-ruled territory. Eventually, they were all sure to fall. From behind their walls, the Empire's few remaining leaders were sure they were watching the terrible end of Sigmar's great dream of human unity. Yet, hope came from the north. The Elector Count of Middenland and Middenheim, Graf Mundred von Selt, broke the Skaven siege of Middenheim and, gathering what forces he could, fought them to a standstill along the lines of the Talabek and Reich rivers. For the next 9 years, Mundred rallied the Empire's people, and in battle after battle, pushed the rat men back into their subterranean realm. Finally, in 1124 IC, at the Battle of Averheim, Mundred broke the Skaven armies and sent them fleeing in terror. There, on the battlefield strewn with Skaven corpses, the remaining Elector Counts declared him, by acclamation, Emperor Mundred I, Skaven Slayer. Emperor Mundred faced a Herculean task of reconstruction. Thanks to the plagues and other depredations caused by the Skaven, it is believed that only roughly 3 out of every 10 souls once living in the Empire had survived the Skaven Wars. Vast tracts of land were laid to waste, and much of the Empire's territory had reverted to wilderness. Mundred's first act upon coming to the throne was to enact punishment for all the foolishness that had led to the disaster. By imperial decree, he stripped the House of Hohenbach of all of its honors and declared the Grand Province of Drakvald dissolved. Its lands merged with Middenland and Nordland. Its Elector Count's runefang was placed into the vaults of the Cathedral of Ulrich in Middenheim. Emperor Mundred I ruled for over 25 years, and in that time gained a reputation for his strength and as a stern but just ruler. Reconstruction began on the Empire's cities and towns, but much knowledge was lost in the Skaven War that could never be recovered. Mundred ruled as a strong emperor, and the Elector Counts deferred to his wishes in all things. After a few years, the people of the Empire began to forget the horrors of the Skaven Wars during the years of 1115 to 1124 IC, and have even forgotten that the Skaven even exist. But the Skaven never forgot. Taking their revenge, the Skavens of Clan Eshin assassinated Emperor Mundred in his bedchamber on the night of Geheimnisnacht Eve 1152 IC, leaving over a dozen daggers in his body and carving out his heart. Like Sigmar before him, Mundred Skavenslayer had left no heirs. The Electoral Council chose a weakling as the next emperor, Emperor Otto of Soland, a pattern that would hold for centuries. The office of the emperor had become a toy to be traded amongst the Elector Counts. It did not matter to them, because they wanted the freedom provided by a weak emperor to engage in their internecine wars without restraint. So common were these that this era has become known in Imperial history as the Age of Wars. Yet the Imperial throne remained an important symbol of human unity, until finally, one Elector Count decided she did not wish to see it in the hands of another. The Age of the Three Emperors, from 1359 to 2000 IC. In 1359 IC, the Grand Duke of Sturland was elected Emperor in Nuln, but Grand Duchess Ottilia I of Talabakland felt that the imperial crown was hers by right. In 1360 IC, she declared herself Empress without an election and banned the cult of Sigmar from Talabakland, in retaliation for the Sturlander Emperor's taxes on the cult of Ulrich. From this point forward, the private wars of the Empire took on a religious character, with Sigmarite loyal provinces clashing with Ulrican ones as the two imperial thrones contested for power. Although it was not uncommon for other provinces to side with their ostensible religious enemies for short-term political or strategic gain. This growing religious militancy of the Empire became more clear with the start of the Great Crusades in 1450 IC. Though the majority of the Imperial Knightly Orders are sworn to the protection of the Empire's people, there are still times when they have found themselves called to war in foreign lands. When Sultan Jafar of the Desert Kingdoms of Araby invaded the distant lands of Estalia, the then current Royarch of Britannia, King Louis the Righteous, raised a grand army of knights and pledged himself to free the distant land from the oppressing clutches of the Arabians. The Bretonnian king issued a call to arms to all warriors of honor in the old world, and the Grand Masters of many imperial knightly orders swore themselves and their knights to this noble cause, seeking to prove their valor in wars beyond the petty civil conflicts that afflicted the Empire during the Age of Wars. During the Bloody Crusade, not only was Estalia freed from the control of Araby, but the gathered knights took the conflict to Araby itself to destroy the Sultan's empire. The knights were filled with religious zeal, and they destroyed the Sultan's decadent palaces, burned thousands of heathen tomes in his grand libraries of ancient lore, and cast down the idols from his temples. The political situation of the empire grew worse in 1547 IC. When the Ulrican Elector Count of Middenland, Grand Duke Heinrich, felt that he had the votes to become emperor by election and unify the empire once again. The other Elector Counts disagreed and made their feelings quite clear by aiming the points of their crossbow quarrels at the Grand Duke's chest. Heinrich stormed off in a rage back to Middenheim and issued a proclamation declaring himself emperor, minting coins and issuing edicts to that effect. Now, the empire had 3 emperors, 1 elected and 2 self-chosen, and the political disintegration only accelerated. The age of the 3 emperors had begun. Emperor Heinrich declared war on Frederick V, the Attilian emperor, based in Talabheim. Meanwhile, Frederick made war on the Nuln emperor, whose name has been lost to history, but who was apparently a political tool of the Grand Theogenes of Sigmar. Even the lesser imperial provinces asserted their autonomy in the general chaos. Western Middenland in 1550 IC declared its independence from Middenheim under the leadership of the von Bildhofen family and received the Runefang of Drakvald in return for supporting the claim of the Nuln Emperor. Although no clear record exists of how this magical rune sword disappeared from the Ulrican vaults in Middenheim and appeared in Nuln, the religious lore of the cult of Ranald refers to this theft as the Great Caper. The county of Sylvania gained its independence from Sturland in the chaotic aftermath of the Night of the Restless Dead in 1681 IC, while the towns of Ostermark rebelled against Talabakland with the help of the Ostland Grand Princes, forming the League of Ostermark in 1905 IC. Outside invasion played a role in the political reshaping of the empire as well, with the destruction of Solland and its absorption by Wissenland in the wake of Gorbad Ironclaw and his Orc invasion of the empire in 1707 IC. Gorbad Ironclaw was one of the most feared Orc warlords of this era, and he eventually commanded a huge horde of orcs and goblins through Blackfire Pass to devastate the imperial provinces of Avaland and Solland. Eldred, the Elector Count of Solland, marched his forces to the Ava River, where he commanded the crossing towards the province capital of Averheim. Gorbad's army plunged into the river and attacked the imperial defenders on the opposite bank. Though the Greenskin horde lost thousands of warriors during the crossing, the orcs gained a foothold on the other side of the river bank and stormed the imperial forces head-on. This marked a grave turn of events for the defenders, whose only hope for victory had been to keep the orcs on the far bank. The Imperial army could not contain all the beachheads and were soon encircled, and Eldred desperately sought to quit the field before his forces were slaughtered. But this decision came too late, for Orc cavalry had already attacked the halfling province of the Moot and had circled around behind the Imperial army. Eldred's personal bodyguard tried to protect their lord, but goblin wolf riders and orcs on their powerful war boars flanked the Imperial army and ultimately caused a rout. Throwing caution to the wind, Eldred bravely led his great swords to face the leader of the orcs. But Gorbad was a monstrously powerful orc, and even armed with a magical runefang, Eldred was brutally slain. The last Elector Count of Solon's body was dismembered and hung upon the Orc Warlord's trophy racks. Gorbad took Eldred's runefang and his committal crown as spoils of war. This battle became known as the Battle of Solon's Crown. Gorbad's invasion was only ultimately defeated at the Siege of Altdorf, though not before the Emperor Sigismund was torn apart by a wyvern, and his army was scattered as winter set in. The greenskin threat to the Empire had ended, but the province of Solund was utterly destroyed, and one of the runefangs was lost. Solund was annexed in its entirety by Visenland. Centuries later, the lost runefang originally forged by Alaric the Mad was rediscovered by a warrior band led by the dwarf Thane Urgrim Stonehammer, deep in the lair of a mutant beast in the World's Edge Mountains. Stonehammer returned the runefang to the Prince of Altdorf, where the sword was placed in the Imperial Treasury, to be presented to the greatest of Imperial heroes and wielded in battle in the times of direst need. Before the peers of the Empire would accede to the annexation of Solund by Visenland, the other Elector Counts demanded the political separation of the city of Nuln from Visenland. Talabheim, too, gained a short-lived independence from Talabakland when the Talabaklander Emperor, Horst the Cautious, refused to attack an invading army in 1750 IC, leading the city to revolt and embrace its own emperor, Helmut II. The political collapse of the empire was complete with the election of Grand Countess Margarita of Nuln in 1979 IC via a rump council of electors. None outside of Visenland, Sturland and Avaland recognized her rule, and the Grand Theogenist declared the office of Emperor vacant. For almost 400 years, the Empire was nothing more than a fading idea of unity in men's minds. One other event heralded the dark times that were about to engulf the Empire: the destruction of the city of Mordheim. Once the greatest city and capital of the League of Ostermark. Corruption and madness ran riot within the walls of Mordheim as the second Millennium IC drew to a close. A twin-tailed comet appeared in the sky above Mordheim on the first day of the year 1999 IC, growing ever closer as the final day of the millennium approached. A depraved festival atmosphere grew in the city, and it is said that demons crept from the shadows, crying with joy and carousing with men and women alike. As the clock struck midnight, the comet, a great mass of green warpstone, smashed down on the city like a divine hammer. The people of the Empire came to believe that Sigma had judged Mordheim lacking. Those unfortunate people who survived the impact were soon horribly mutated by exposure to such high concentrations of warpstone, and, to make matters worse, the Skaven were drawn to the city in large numbers by such massive concentrations of the chaotic substance. Mordheim had become the city of the damned, cursed forever to be a place of ill fortune and misery until its eventual destruction at the hands of the Sigmarite forces of the Grand Theogenist and a combined force of the Imperial Knightly Orders. Yet even today, the Skaven-haunted ruins of Mordheim are a byword for sin and moral corruption. The third millennium, forged anew in fire. As the time of the three emperors dragged on with none of the claimants achieving final superiority, a dreadful threat to mankind was stirring in the frigid shadow of the World's Edge Mountains. The county of Sylvania, the most infamous region of the Empire, had long been shunned by most folk of any sense, but its wicked reputation truly began when Vlad von Carstein, a vampire of ancient lineage, wrested control of the province from the previous ill-loved Count, Otto von Drag, by marrying his daughter, Isabella von Drag, to Vlad von Carstein in 1797 IC. Vlad and Isabella came to share a true, if unholy love, and Vlad transformed her into a particularly vicious vampire, the first of his new von Carstein lineage. Many of the other Sylvanian noble families objected to the thought of having an outsider rule them, but these dissidents were quickly silenced by foul and unnatural means. Under Vlad's tyrannical grip, the province soon flourished for the first time in its history. The Elector Counts of the Empire looked on with indifference, too caught up in their own schemes for power to pay much attention to a poor and backwater province. For the next 200 years, Count Vlad von Carstein ruled over Sylvania under the guise of different identities to prevent anyone from becoming aware of his undead nature. In 2010 IC, judging the Empire to be at its weakest, Vlad launched his attempt to become a vampire emperor, beginning the first of a series of vampire wars upon the Empire. The Vampire Wars, from 2010 to 2145 IC. Marching at the head of the Sylvanian army and a massive host of undead troops he had raised from the graves of Sylvania using a potent necromantic spell drawn from one of the books of Nagash, Vlad invaded Sturland and laid waste to Ostermark before turning his attentions to the heart of the Empire. However, in 2025, Vlad was slain by Jarek Kruger, Grand Master of the Knights of the White Wolf. Unfortunately for the Empire, not even death could hold Vlad for long. Kruger's body was found at the base of Ulrichsburg 1 year later, making Vlad's return apparent. For the next 25 years, Vlad's undead armies ravaged the lands of the Empire until 2051 IC. He eventually fought his way to Altdorf, the seat of Prince Ludwig, one of the 3 claimants to the title of Emperor. The siege lasted for many months, but in the Empire's darkest hour, the Grand Theogenist of Sigmar, Wilhelm III, seized Vlad in a desperate grip and bore him from the city's walls, impaling them both on the wooden stakes that lay at the bottom. With Vlad dead, much of the Sylvanian army began to disintegrate as the necromantic magic maintaining its undead troops unraveled, and the surviving vampires of the von Carstein line were forced to retreat. Prince Ludwig rallied his forces to give pursuit, but fearful that victory would allow him to cement support for his bid for the imperial throne, his rivals united against him, and the pernicious undead laws of Sylvania were allowed the time to regain their strength. Years later, Count Conrad von Carstein emerged as Vlad's successor and launched another invasion of the Empire. Conrad was so vicious a vampire that the 3 claimants to the imperial throne were forced to ally against him, and he too was ultimately defeated. The dust of his ashes floating in the wind, cut down by the dwarf hero Grufbad and the soon-to-be Count of Marienburg, Helmar, at the Battle of Grimmoor in 2121 IC. The last and most dangerous of the vampire counts was Manfred von Carstein, a subtle, devious, and treacherous vampire lord who was perhaps the most dangerous of the von Carstein line. He allowed the various contenders for the imperial crown to think that with Conrad's death, the threat from Sylvania had ended, and simply waited for the civil strife to begin anew. When the Empire was once more racked by civil war, Manfred attacked, his undead legions marching through the snow to Altdorf, and defeating all the armies that gathered to oppose him. He appeared triumphant until the Grand Theogenist of Sigmar, Kurt III, appeared on the battlements of the city and began to recite the great spell of unbinding. Seeing many of his undead troops crumbling to dust, Manfred ordered a hasty retreat. After a failed attack on Marienburg, the vampire count was forced to return to Sylvania. The imperial nobility finally put aside their self-interested scheming and invaded Sylvania in force to end the threat of the undead once and for all. Eventually, Manfred was brought to battle at Helfen in 2145 IC, where Prince Martin of Sturland cut him down. For his heroic feat, the Count of Sturland claimed all of Sylvania as part of his province, and thus ended the Vampire Wars. Though the ever-present threat of the Vampire Count's return ensures that none forget the dread of Sylvania, where the dead never fully rest. Though now officially a part of Sturland, Sylvania is now an abandoned province where the dead are easily stirred and the dark forests are prowled by unknown terrors. The dawn of the 24th century IC saw the development of an even greater threat to all the peoples of the old world, this time in the north. The powers of the Chaos Gods had waxed fat upon the myriad sacrifices of their faithful and the excesses of humanity and other mortals over the previous centuries. The hand of the ruinous powers began to move with great strength across the face of the Warhammer world once more. Auroras were seen as far south as Nuln. Omens in the temples of the Empire spoke of a coming time of great danger, and Kislevan scouts reported a vast, horrible army composed of the forces of chaos gathering beyond the Taiga in the Chaos Wastes under the command of the powerful Northman and champion of Chaos Undivided named Asavar Kul the Ever-Chosen. The great war against chaos was about to begin. The Great War against Chaos from 2302 to 2369 IC. In 2302 IC, the forces of Chaos, comprised of Chaos Warriors, Beastmen, and even powerful demon hosts, crossed the River Linsk into Kislev, laying waste to the Kislevite cities of Erengrad and Prague, and marching on to besiege the capital city of Kislev. The siege of Prague had lasted throughout the spring and summer, with the city's brave defenders hurling back their attackers time and again with desperate heroics and stalwart bravery. But as winter set in and the year drew to a close, Prague fell and the hordes of chaos ran through its tortured streets. The raw power of chaos engulfed the city, and Prague was changed forever. Its survivors fused together into hellish and inhuman mutant shapes. Living bodies fused into the walls of the city itself, so that it became impossible to tell flesh from stone. Distorted human faces peered out from walls, agonized limbs writhed from the streets, and pillars of stone groaned with human voices. Prague had become a living nightmare, and stood as a grim warning of the suffering that lay ahead for the whole Warhammer world if the warriors of the ruinous powers proved victorious over the forces of order. A chaos fleet sailed the Sea of Claws, laying waste to the coasts of the old world and sinking any ships they could find. The Tsar of Kislev sent messages to each of the Elector Count's courts, begging for help. But the response was confused and bordered on panic. No leader was chosen for the Empire's military efforts, for none of the Elector Counts trusted the others enough to cede authority to him or her. The high priests of Sigmar and Ulrich squabbled with each other over who should take the overall command of Imperial forces, whilst many of the nobility refused to send help for fear their neighbors would attack their lands in their absence. Some even felt the cause was lost and openly began to worship the dark gods, hoping for mercy from the forces of chaos after the Empire's fall. One man did not give up or give in to fear and apathy. Magnus von Bilthofen of Nuln, a young noble and priest of Sigmar, still believed in the dream of a united empire, strong enough to defeat the forces of chaos and the demonic servants of the dark gods. Within the city of Nuln, a powerful Tzeentch cult known as the Magi led the largest of the uprisings, unleashing demons and other horrors upon the city. Those who remained loyal to Sigmar prayed for deliverance, receiving an answer in the twin-tailed comet that soared through the night sky. Magnus saw the comet, and inspired by his grounding in the Church of Sigmar, used his influence as a minor noble to rally the people. Under Magnus's leadership, Nuln was liberated from chaos and took his crusade across the empire. Magnus was a magnificent orator whose rousing speeches raised a massive following amongst the common folk of the empire. He marched northward from city to city, addressing the people in the marketplaces, gathering about him an army the likes of which had not been seen within the empire for centuries. Other imperial armies also began to muster from the electors and other powers, either swayed by Magnus's tongue or afraid of any refusal to aid the growing force. By the time Magnus reached the great city of Middenheim, his legions of followers became the largest military formation ever assembled within the Empire. In 2302 IC, he reached Middenheim, where he sought an audience with Jarl Ulrich Christoph to gain support for the war. After Christoph denounced Magnus as a charlatan, Magnus bravely walked through the Sacred Flame, a holy site of the Church of Ulrich, which separates the pure from the tainted, and the truthful from the liars. After miraculously emerging unscathed, Magnus had proven the righteousness of his cause and gained the support of a powerful ally. He tactfully appointed Christoph as the leader of his cavalry force. Just as the Empire finished uniting behind Magnus, a message was received from the Kislevite leader Tsar Alexis Vasilievich. It told of a crushing defeat inflicted on the army of Kislev, leaving her cities wide open to attack. Magnus heeded the news and decided to march to Kislev, and once there, to take the fight to their foe. As the new year began, he finished consolidating his army and split it into two mighty forces, one of infantry and one of cavalry, setting Jarl Ulrich Christoph to lead the former and heading the latter himself. With their greater mobility, the cavalry force headed towards Kislev to buy time for the second half of the army. In Talabheim, Magnus met with Peter Laszlo, who was accompanied by 3 high elves. The war had reached its crisis point as the forces of chaos prepared to cross the border into the Empire. The elves were powerful archmages, namely Teclis and his 2 comrades, Finreyr and Irtil. Although Magnus had a strong faith in Sigmar, he did not have the same faith in the men he led. Despite knowing they could defeat any mortal enemy, the demons of chaos were not mortal. Magnus knew that the advantage the armies of chaos had over his own lay in the winds of magic, but traditionally, any man of the Empire who dabbled with magic was seen as a pawn of chaos himself, With the help of the High Elves, however, a new system could be devised to allow humans to wield the winds without opening themselves to corruption. With this new status quo possible, Magnus declared an amnesty to those who could use magic, subject to the judgment of the High Elves. Teclis and his brethren subsequently used their own arts to assemble those who could be taught. The High Elven wizard Teclis and his companions had joined Magnus during the march north and assisted him with their advice and magic, and also trained a few of the Imperial wizards in how to use magic to defend their brethren. After they learned of the fall of Prague, dwarves from Karaz-al-Karag, though themselves under siege by Chaos forces and greenskins, joined the Tsar within the city of Kislev. The first assault of the Chaos forces, mainly composed of beastmen, drove the Kislevite defenders from their outer defenses and behind the city walls. It was the stolid determination of the dwarves that prevented the hordes of beastmen from breaking through the city gates. As the Chaos hordes prepared for a second attack, they were struck in the rear by the combined forces of Magnus's Imperial troops and Teclis's devastating magical assault. The Chaos champion, Asavar Kul, divided his forces and sent one attack to the city and one to counter the Imperial army. The Imperials managed to inflict a resounding defeat upon the troops of the Chaos hordes sent against them with Teclis's magical support. But the forces of Chaos were too large to be completely destroyed, and they eventually redeployed and managed to push the Imperial army onto the defensive, keeping it away from the relief of the city. The High Elven mage, Yertel, was slain by a Keeper of Secrets. On the city walls, the battle between the forces of Chaos and the Imperial Relief Army was seen by the Kislevite defenders. 300 dwarves broke out of the city gates in an attempt to try and reach the Imperial Relief forces, but they were beaten back. Only half of the dwarves returned to the beleaguered Kislevite capital. When it seemed that all hope was lost to the defenders of the city, the advance Imperial force, which had been sent to relieve fallen Prague but had turned back to rejoin the main body of the Imperial army, appeared on the northern horizon, on the Hill of Heroes, and launched a devastating attack born of hatred upon the Chaos forces. Watching the enemy suddenly broken by the appearance of the Imperial reinforcements, Magnus spurred his men on to one last Herculean effort to relieve the city. Seeing the forces of order had gained some momentum, the gates of Kislev were opened, and the Kislevites and their dwarf allies spilled forth to slam into the army of Chaos from yet another flank. Caught between three separate offensives on every side, the forces of Chaos lost all discipline, miling as a mass to be cut down where they stood. As Magnus prepared to lead another charge, a voice warned him of a beast in human form approaching. The enemy leader, Asavar Kul. The ever-chosen challenged the champion of Sigmar to single combat as a test of might between their respective gods. After an awesome conflict of great magnitude, Magnus eventually triumphed, disarming Kul and knocking him to the ground. After removing his helmet, Asavad admitted defeat, saying he had failed the Chaos Gods and the fight belonged to Magnus. Having slain Asavad, Magnus touched his golden hammer and reflected, "It was your gods who failed you. My god is always with me." At the same time, the Kislevite and Dwarf troops broke through and engaged the Chaos Army at their respective flanks. Caught between three armies, the Chaos Horde was finally ground down and destroyed, saving the old world from being Chaos's thrall. Ulriksson and Vasilovich recognized Magnus as the instrument of Chaos's defeat, with Erengrad being relieved and Prague leveled for rebuilding. Chaos was driven back to its domains. As the last piece of cleanup, Magnus's army destroyed the cursed city of Mordheim, before liberating Ostland and Ostermark and clearing the Empire's forests of beastmen. After their defeat, the strength of the ruinous powers of Chaos slowly ebbed away and returned to their pre-war strength. But an echo of the realm of Chaos would always remain within Prague, though it was leveled and subsequently rebuilt. The Chaos Gods returned to their eternal bickering and infighting. The power of Chaos undivided, once more submerged beneath the ruinous powers' own intense antipathy for one another. Magnus, who had earned his moniker the Pious, returned to the Empire as its greatest savior and warrior since Sigmar himself, and was quickly installed as the new Emperor by the Elector Counts, largely to popular acclaim, and because he now commanded the loyalty of a very large, very battle-hardened army. Magnus proceeded to purge the lands of the Empire of the taint of chaos and the anarchy of bandits, greenskins, and beastmen that remained for several years after the end of the Great War. Order was eventually restored across the Empire and in Kislev. Though Finubar resisted the idea, Teclis taught the humans of the Empire the principles of magic, as understood by the High Elves, and helped them found the colleges of magic with Emperor Magnus's full agreement, as it had become clear that despite the Imperial prejudice against the use of magic as being tainted by chaos, humanity and the Empire would need its power if it was to successfully defend itself from the future depredations of chaos. On Ulthuan, despite Tyrion's attempts to reclaim the Blighted Isle, the Dark Elves eventually succeeded in occupying the Altar of Cain. Emperor Magnus reigned for 65 years, and many regard his reign as among the happiest periods in the Empire's long history since Sigmar's own rule. A general peace reigned throughout the land, and the reunification of the Empire brought increased commerce and prosperity as trade flowed like water. Magnus took steps to increase the defenses of the Empire against the dark powers of chaos and their servants, removing the ancient imperial ban on wizardry and even creating the Imperial Colleges of Magic under the tutelage of the High Elf wizard Teclis, the most powerful mage of the Warhammer world, who had come to the Empire's aid from the High Elven Kingdom of Ulthuan during the Great War against Chaos. A new age of intellectual vigor and inquiry had begun for humanity. Magnus, also recognized the changing balance of imperial power between city and country, granting Nuln the status of a city-state, whilst ratifying the political reintegration of Middenland and Middenheim under the Todbringer Grafs of Middenheim. His distant cousins, the Middenland von Bildhofens, had died during the war, but Magnus had no desire to claim the province for himself, and denied his brother's right to do so. Instead, its electoral vote was put into abeyance. Magnus also acceded to the formal reunification of Talabheim and Talabakland, which had already occurred for all practical purposes centuries before. Magnus of Nuln died in his sleep in 2369 IC. For his great works, devotion to the Empire, and dedication to Sigmar and his dream, a conclave of the electors voted to give Magnus the posthumous title the Pious, and declared his birthday to be an empire-wide Day of Thanks. The Reichland Bloodline of Emperors, from 2429 to 2519 IC. The Empire could not long escape its own fractious nature. The electors rejected Magnus's brother Gunther as his successor, and instead chose Leopold Unfahiger, the Elector Count and Grand Count of Sturland, as the new emperor. As had happened before under the imperial electoral system, the need to bargain led successful candidates to cede imperial powers and privileges to the electors, gradually weakening the emperor's office once again. This problem led the Unfahiger emperors to seek other sources of imperial revenue to give them leverage against the other electors. Emperor Dieter IV carried this tendency too far when he reputedly accepted large bribes from the burgomeisters of the great commercial city of Marienburg to acknowledge its independence from the Empire as a free city-state. The scandal of an entire imperial province breaking away with the Emperor's permission was so shocking that an emergency meeting of the electors was called in the Volkshalle in Altdorf. In 2429 IC, the electors deposed Dieter IV and put in his place Grand Prince Wilhelm of Reichland, the direct ancestor of the current emperor Karl Franz I. To avoid a civil war after the defeat of an imperial army outside of Marienburg, the new Emperor Wilhelm III recognized the Westerland's independence. It soon became known as the Wasteland in the Empire, perhaps out of a sense of pique, and made Dieter IV the Grand Duke and Elector Count of Talabakland, from which he detached Talabheim as a separate city-state in a manner similar to Nuln. Perhaps it was fear of what disunity had almost cost them during the Great War against Chaos, but the imperial electors, their vassals, and the priests of the imperial cults all made a serious effort to avoid another period of civil war. Clandestine aristocratic maneuvers and conspiracies were another thing, however. The current emperor, Karl Franz, acceded to the imperial throne in 2502 IC as a young and vigorous man, ruling from the imperial capital of Altdorf like his predecessors. He showed more skill and character than all of his immediate ancestors, and held out the promise of strong leadership for the empire. The electors felt pressured to toe the Imperial line, and he skillfully played the cults of Sigmar and Ulrich against each other in their attempts to gain his favor. Pundits and scholars alike claim that Karl Franz is able to maintain order by forcing each Imperial faction into deals that are mutually acceptable. With an excellent understanding of leverage, many of the Emperor's political victories have been won by granting a person not what they want, but instead what they do not want any of their rivals to have. Using such tactics, Karl Franz was able to convince the guilds of Altdorf to sign the infamous Stench Act of 2506 IC, committing themselves to large fines and fees not because they believed in a cleaner Altdorf, but because they thought the cost would destroy their rival guilds. A powerful statesman, aided in no small way by the excellent advisors he has chosen, Emperor Karl Franz has managed to steer the empire through many dangers. A government? You call that a government? Looks more like the invention of a deranged snotling. From Count Claude Villecroix of Paravon, a Bretonnian ambassador to the court of the Emperor Karl Franz. Contrary to popular beliefs, the Empire is not a unified nation ruled by a powerful central government, but is in actuality a massive confederation of fiercely independent states and provinces whose inhabitants are tied together only by a common language, a shared faith in Sigmar, and a mutual imperial culture. Nowadays, there are two types of states: the provinces and the city-state. Sigmar was a wise and calculating leader, and he had the foresight to recognize that the empire was far too big to be ruled by a single man, and so he gave the title of counts to all the tribal leaders, each responsible for managing his own territory, but subject to the emperor in matters relating to its rulership. Their independence was supposed to counterbalance the power of the emperor should he prove too tyrannical as a leader, as well as to ensure mutual but non-violent competition amongst each of the imperial counts. When it became known that Sigmar did not have an heir to inherit the imperial throne, the invention of the electoral system was successful in avoiding a civil war amongst the various counts. However, it complicated matters even further in creating and maintaining a successive ruler. Those ambitious elector counts that wish to become emperor have been known to give away privileges, titles, and power to any man that will cast his vote for him. The interests of each voters were such that they seldom rallied around a strong candidate, for they may find another of his rivals far more generous in their gifts, which has resulted in the weakening of the imperial system. Even when the imperial throne is transferred to his heir by majority vote, thanks to the previous emperor's influence, voters were quick to remind the newly elected emperor to renew the promises made by his predecessor. While the empire had a fair share of strong and highly competent emperors ruling the empire, many times has the imperial throne been occupied by an uncaring lord who allows his subjects to steal and exploit the imperial system and her people. often going so far as to ignore the imperial edicts once placed by wise and caring rulers of ages past. However, the imperial system as a whole still continues to work for the Empire as was its purpose, allowing any wise and ambitious emperor to take the throne and use its powers to better the people under their reign. And now, onto the Imperial Law. In theory, the Emperor is free to make whatever laws and regulations he or she wishes and have it apply to the whole of the Empire. The truth is more nuanced, for laws must pass the review of the Prime Estates, who report to the electors. One bad report is often all the excuse an elector needs to quietly not enforce the law or deny it altogether in times of a weak emperor. In such cases, the emperor, if he is determined to see the law obeyed, will exercise diplomatic and even public pressure on the recalcitrant elector to come to heel. Often this is enough to gain grudging acceptance. But if the elector is determined, an emperor may claim peremptory jurisdiction and have the case heard in his own courts. In rare cases, continued defiance by an elector may merit military action, as Karl Franz's ancestor Wilhelm threatened against Elector Gunvald of Averland in the case of the Pudding Tax Revolt of 2433 IC. Imperial law concerns itself mostly with revenues, security from foreign and internal threats, the regulation of sorcery, and the rooting out of chaos cults. Many emperors have claimed jurisdiction over the succession to electoral thrones when the succession is in dispute, and even the right in extreme cases to depose electors, elevate new families to the electoral rank, and even give whole provinces to another elector, as was the case with Drakvald under Emperor Mundred. Though rooted in ancient law and the precedent set by Sigmar himself, no elector formally acknowledges this right, and all resist it in any but the direst cases, lest a lasting precedent is set. Imperial courts exist in all the major cities of the Empire, including the capitals of the Grand Provinces, with judges appointed by the Emperor through the office of the Imperial Authority over the case, leading to extended wrangling while the defendant or parties to a civil case swing in the wind. The Council of State. Due to its size, the Imperial Government is considered far too large and complex for a single man or woman to function properly. It is common that each day the Emperor must devote attention to dozens of questions, from newly introduced tax policies, the final appeal of a prisoner convicted of treason, or even the official opening of a ceremonial fairground. To succeed in establishing a priority order in this complex system and ensure that only individuals whose cases are really crucial get an audience with the Emperor himself, successful emperors have often surrounded themselves with advisors chosen from members amongst the most prominent noble families, so that they may assist on legal, financial, diplomatic, and military matters in the Emperor's stead. Over time, this gathering of councillors turned into a formal meeting, which officially became the Council of State. The current members of the State Council are Volkmar the Grim, the spiritual leader, Siegfried von Wulfen, the Chancellor of the Reichland, Balthasar Geld, the Counselor of Matters Magical, Amadeus Mencken, the Chamberlain of the Seal, Kurt Hellborg, the military advisor to the Emperor, Lotte Horsfall, the Chancellor of the Imperial Treasury, Agatha von Bern, the Supreme Law Lord, and Arne Darmstadt, the Chamberlain of the Imperial House. Each member of the council controls a large bureaucracy that helps administer the affairs of the state. Such is the importance of their position within the government that the common people will probably never see these members in person, except maybe indirectly in official or ceremonial events. The Prime Estates. The Prime Estates is an imperial organization that was created to help administrate the actions and well-being of the Emperor in person. At the end of the 11th century, when Boris the Incompetent tried to confer the title of Duke to his favorite racehorse, the electors unanimously decided that they had to administrate the Emperor's actions as to keep pace with the Empire's people. So, they deputed one representative each to form a watchdog body that would take the name of Prime Estates. This institution is located within a beautiful building in the confines of the capital, ostensibly open to any person of recognized nobility, although the lackeys of the Emperor are carefully kept away. In fact, the Prime Estates has now become the Supreme Court. All imperial edicts are carefully examined in the interest of the state, with documented reports being immediately sent to the electors who would choose either to support or veto the edict. This organization has the powerful ability to refuse any edict that does not suit them or the Empire's interests, allowing the Prime Estates to have near complete control over what the Emperor is logically placed to decide. Each elector count has ensured an established representation in the capital, embassies directed by a loyal family member or close acquaintance. These ambassadors would discuss new imperial decree or legislation, as well as send these reports back to the electors that had elevated them to such a position. As they have the power to reject decisions that do not suit them, it is important for the Emperor to obtain the approval of the Prime Estate if he hopes to accomplish anything. In theory, the Emperor also has a veto over the choice, but in practice, it would be very difficult for him to exercise it. Indeed, without a real majority support amongst the electors, the Emperor has no chance to assert his right of veto. The latest attempt to do so was Emperor Matthias II, who wished to institute the first ever democracy. But the threat of civil war by the other elector counts was so pressing that he was forced to give it up. The Provincial Government. Since the time of Sigmar Heldenhammer, the lands of what is today the Empire was divided between many semi-autonomous states that are collectively referred to as the Great Provinces or Electoral Provinces, named because the elector counts who rule them traditionally have a say in the election of the next emperor. The provinces are further divided into various counties, baronies, or leagues whose administrative governors are appointed by the elector count. These regional governors in turn appoint the governors of cities. This practice, however, is not universally prevalent. some cities have been known to elect their own municipal council. Theoretically, the boundaries of the imperial provinces were based on the territories of the ancient barbarian tribes that Sigmar had united around him during his reign as the nation's first emperor. However, over the last several centuries, the dynastic quarrels and ruthless ambition between various lords and counts have altered the borders, where new states have emerged while others have since disappeared from history. The patriotic citizenry that lives within these provinces are fiercely proud of their people's traditions and ancestry. In essence, the people of each provinces are in many ways a completely different people, with many expressions or dialects varying from province to province. The people of the East and North are generally more hardy and warlike as they are regularly victims of invasions, while those in the West and South are perceived as more cosmopolitan and civilized or effeminate and proud, according to the view of the person to whom a person asks. The style of government also varies from province to province. Talabakland, for example, is firmly autocratic, while Soland had many democratic ideals and institutions during its existence. In the overall health of the nation, however, the political structure between various governments has very little influence on the lives of the citizens of the empire overall, for the rich are still wildly favored over the poor who live in squalor. The lands of the great provinces are themselves a patchwork of smaller semi-autonomous states or holdings belonging to a certain religious cult or martial order, chartered towns and cities, and lands held by various noble families or even elector counts of other provinces. This patchwork is the result of a millennia of feudalism, inheritance, war and purchases. Each noble, from the smallest landholders to the greatest duke, is theoretically beholden to one above him, up to the elector counts, who would then answer only to the emperor himself. Thus, if the emperor has a problem with the Duke of Nibelwald, he has to make his complaints through the Elector of Avaland, who the Duke is a vassal towards. The City-States. The city-state forms a privileged, semi-autonomous state that can assert its political, legal, and military defense on a specific territory, the closed city wall, and its immediate entour. The city is a concentration of economic, political, religious, academic, and ideological power, thanks to its very diverse society and its semi-democratic ruling. Most cities form independent political entities within the greater Imperial Government. For the vast majority of the inhabitants of the Empire, it is through the city that government is manifested in everyday life. This is where the taxes are collected, where the criminal courts are served, where a military service is completed, and where the goods are sold. The governmental structure varies from city to city. In some of them, the governor is sometimes appointed by the elector count as an autocratic authority, whilst others consist of democratically elected individuals from several noble or mercantile families. The mountains that ring the three sides of the natural lands of the Empire are like the walls of a stout castle. These days, however, those walls are so thinly manned that the castle looks set to fall. From Albert Kornhammer, a priest of Sigmar. The Empire is a vast region that consists of a multitude of landscapes. The domains of the Imperial Authority usually encompasses the lands in between the three large mountain ranges that occupy the Empire's eastern, southern, and western borders. The northern border is usually defined along the shores of the Sea of Claws within Nordland, whilst the northeastern border is usually not as well defined. In theory, the borders between Kislev and the Empire are often defined by the edge of the Great Forest and the Forest of Shadows. However, this has not always been the case, and perhaps the most defining borders between the two nations are along the banks of the upper Talabek River and the edge of the Forest of Shadows. Within this large territory, the lands of the Empire are often further divided between several distinct regions with varying landscapes. The lands of the Northern Empire usually consist almost entirely of large swaths of forest and wilderness, whilst the lands to the south usually consist of fertile plains fit for large-scale agriculture. The Ramparts of Stone. The mountains that encompass the southern borders of the Empire are the Black Mountains, a range of mountains that branches out from the Greater World's Edge Mountains. This massive region of treacherous terrain is a natural border that divides the Empire from the frontiers of the Border Princes. The most viable route through the mountains lies within a region known famously as Blackfire Pass. This pass serves as an important trade route for the Empire, as it follows the ancient road system that connects the city of Avarheim with that of the dwarfish capital of Karaz-a-Karak. The southern borders are also a frequent hotspot for marauding armies of green-skin invaders hoping to plunder the lands of the Empire, with Blackfire Pass being the most obvious route. As such, the province of Averland is usually given the duty to protect the southern borders from enemy invasions. The mountains that encompass the western borders of the Empire are perhaps the least treacherous of all the bordering mountain ranges. The Grey Mountains act as a buffer zone for the territories of the Kingdom of Bretonnia and that of the Empire, although in the Bretonians' case, the entire Grey Mountain range belongs to the Dukedom of Montfort and Paravon respectively. However, such a claim is always disputed, with the dwarves of the Grey Mountains having built halls such as Karak Norn, Karak Ziflin, and Karak Asgaraz long before the founding of Bretonnia. There are about 3 passes that can be used to traverse these mountains, which usually consist of the Gisore Gap to the north, the Axe Bite Pass in the center, and the Grey Lady Pass to the south. Although these mountains are less dangerous than other mountain ranges, the Grey Mountains are known to have the fewest mineral deposits within the whole of the Old World. Perhaps the greatest and largest of these mountains lies to the east, within the towering peaks of the World's Edge Mountains. Considered by many to be the homeland of the dwarves, these mighty mountain ranges stand like titanic walls that separate the civilized lands of the Old World from the horrors and warfare of the distant East. As such, it is undisputedly one of the most dangerous mountains within the entire Old World. The gods of the Empire rule over all, regardless of whether you are a peasant or burgher, knight or priest, rat-catcher of the Emperor himself. All must pay heed to the wisdom, rules, and decrees of the gods. To ignore them, or worse, belittle them, is to invite disaster. From Alfred Schumann, a priest of Verona. A deeply superstitious people, the Empire has always looked to their gods for hope, prosperity, and salvation upon a world that is awash with misery, destruction, and corruption. Generally, nearly every village, town, and city has dedicated a portion of its wealth and land to the construction and maintenance of at least one imperial deity. It is from these temples and shrines that people deposit their daily offerings, hoping to curry their favor and perhaps improve their lives in some way or form. These cults possess a considerable political influence on the workings of the Empire, be it through religious or fiscal means. Such is the case that even the cult of Sigmar and the cult of Ulrich have an electoral power to choose who shall become the next emperor, a power that is usually reserved only for the elector counts. Currently, the cult of Sigmar holds the strongest influence within the Empire's large web of bureaucracy, having the ability to cast 3 votes within the selection process, with each vote being divided towards the Grand Theogenist and his 2 arch-lictors. Such is the ever-growing influence of the Sigmarite cult that it is now common to consider the people of the Empire simply as Sigmar's folk, or the Sons of Sigmar. Depending on the location of a particular community, some areas of the Empire have a certain degree of worship, often towards a certain family of gods. Within the northern provinces of the Empire, the people of those harsh lands have been known to worship an older pantheon of gods, known as the Elder Gods, whilst in the south, the worship of the classical gods is more common. Such religious differences have been known to have resulted in the Empire experiencing a certain degree of religious strife, the most prominent of which was during a period of civil war that many historians call the Age of the 3 Emperors. During that time, an elected emperor, along with Sigmarite followers, fought against 2 self-proclaimed emperors of the province of Middenland and Talabakland, both of which were worshippers of Ulrich and Tal. The resulting devastation and centuries of warfare has ensured the creation of a regular conclave of faith in Altdorf for the high priests of every major faith in the Empire to gather together, letting them air their disputes to the reigning emperor and come into an agreement without the need for bloodshed. The Patron God. The Empire has been known to worship a specific god that is not connected with either the Elder or Classical gods. Instead, the Imperials worship a god who was originally born as a mortal, who founded the Empire and was rewarded by the old world pantheons with the ultimate gift of godhood. Sigmar, warrior god of mankind, and the founder of the Empire. The Northern Gods. The Elder Gods, also known as the Country Gods or the Northern Gods, are the oldest of the Old World pantheons, whose origins of worship can be traced back for nearly 2 millennia during the time when primitive human tribes began to settle within the lands of the Empire and the Old World. They are comprised of Tal, the god of the wilds and the husband of Raya; Raya, the goddess of agriculture and birth and the wife of Tal; Manan, the god of the sea and the son of Tal and Raya; and at last Ulrich, god of winter and wolves and the younger brother of Tal. The Southern Gods. The classical gods, also known as the town gods or the southern gods, are the youngest of the Old World pantheons, whose worship is usually confined to the lands of the Southern Empire and the lands of Telia and Astalia. They are comprised of Mor, the god of death and the husband of Verena; Verena, the goddess of justice and learning and the wife of Mor; Myrmidia, the goddess of warfare and strategy, and the daughter of Mor and Verena; Shalia, the goddess of mercy and healing, and the daughter of Mor and Verena as well; Ronald, the god of trickery and thieves; and Cain, the god of blood and murder, and the younger brother of Mor.